Chike, correct me if I'm wrong. I know of no tradition propagated by folks African of African descent within which they cultivated and sustained a commitment to destroy white people.
The tradition, by and large, stands against that kind of genocidal impulse. I think that you're right about that. I mean, you have, I think you do have. I would say in the 20th century, you have people who use rhetoric of that kind at times, right? It's not right. It stands against the mainstream of the tradition by far.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You may have a person or even a small group who may come up and say this, but what to me is striking is it doesn't become, number one, institutionalized and therefore become an ongoing cross-generational perpetuated tradition.
Right, no.
I mean, it is just astounding to me. After all that was done, here's another way in which I concretize it. Think of an enslaved African descendant woman on a plantation who's working in the big house. Now, she could have adopted an attitude, a posture that said, one way to bring this to its knees is to kill all the white children that I care for so they can't grow up to be enslavers. Or since I'm preparing the food for this family, I will poison them all. And we're gonna get all the Black women who work in these homes to agree that on the same time, we're gonna poison all the families we serve. We're gonna bring this to their knee. My own experience growing up with my mother, maternal grandmother, and other Black women who cared for white children, they never entertained any idea that they should visit upon the children any retribution for what the adult white folk were doing, ever. I mean, is it the idea that you would punish an innocent child for the sins of their parents? No, you don't do that. But they never even thought that they should punish the adult whites with the retribution of like endeavors from what they were being suffered. My grandmother, she said to me, son, the only way you can keep somebody in the ditch is that you got to get out in the ditch with them. Don't get out in the ditch with the white man. I mean, that's just, when I look at what's happening now, the notion that, an eye, not only an eye for an eye, but 2 eyes for 1 eye. We'll take all your eyes, your teeth, and your ears for what you did in taking one of our eyes. And you sit there and go, okay, how is this supposed to play out long term? And I'm astounded by the lessons offered up in history by folks African and African descent in that regard that has not been attended to. Never declaring war on white people. Never declaring war on white people. And I asked, why? And my proposal is there were some ethical decisions being made about what would be appropriate, and that such war making would not be appropriate.
One thing I'll jump in to add here is that, some people, I think, would automatically think of someone like Malcolm X, or if they happen to know a bit more, maybe even someone like David Walker, when listening to Lou here, and they may want to use these 2 figures that I just mentioned, Malcolm X from the 20th century and David Walker from the 19th century, as ones who were for war on white people, right? I mean, I was careful to say that, the kind of genocidal impulse that I believe Lou was speaking about, you don't see it in Malcolm or in Walker, right? What you do see is an attempt to to bring Black people toward a readiness to use violence, right? Excuse me. Self-defensively, although when we're talking about self-defense, in the Walker case, this would include, right, not just the case where someone's actually being violent towards you, but a case where violence will help you escape enslavement, right? And then, we can even also bring in here the importance of Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth and what he's saying about anti-colonial violence, right? To now, and Frantz Fanon is originally from Martinique, but he ends up in Africa, based in North Africa, really for the final part of his life, and an anti-colonial revolution in Africa is something that he's very concerned with, involved with. He works with the FLN, which is the revolutionary party that was fighting a war against France for Algeria's independence. And so precisely because one of the, you could say, dominant aspects of the tradition is let's say a certain kind of generosity and a slow, an encouraging of slowness to violence, or even forbidding of violence, right? So in pacifist traditions that we have in the Africana tradition, right? In response to that, you get, right, other figures who are saying, actually, if we care about our own dignity, if we care about our own humanity, right, we have to be able to express this through violence where necessary, right, in order to affirm human freedom, affirm human dignity, right, and our right to be here as people, right. And so I paint that just to suggest that this is one of the traditions of debate, right? What is the role of violence, right? And where is it justified? How should we pursue it, right? And it's very important that these are always not simply pragmatic questions. They are pragmatic questions in the sense of like, well, how do we best accomplish our goal, right? And our goal is, for example, freedom from slavery, right? So there's a pragmatic question of what's going to work. But there are also, questions that are more about what it is to be a human being, right? Yes. That are always at stake here, right? Questions about dignity, questions about the value of freedom, right? That are coming up when we have these kinds of debates around violence.
And just the David Walker case is an interesting one for me because it highlights how many of figures throughout the diaspora and African continent in particular, how astute many of them became about the uses of rhetoric. Frederick Douglass is, to me, one of the masters of rhetoric. But let's just take David Walker. So David Walker writes this text, which he's making this declaration about what slavery, right? But when you stop to think about it, and what the subject figures on whose behalf he's doing this, and to whom allegedly this written text is directed, overwhelmingly cannot read. So I think it's worthwhile to stop and say, well, now, wait a minute. What's going on here? So if you read the text, it's like, slaves, here's what you all should do. I'm writing something, directing it to you. And he aims it into the slaveholding South. Well, most of the slaves can't read. So what is he really up to? Right? And I think you've got to start asking some more nuanced, strategic questions about the use of rhetoric, because I would offer for consideration, his audience is not composed of enslaved African peoples. His audience is really slaveholders. He's gaming slaveholders, right? I mean, if you take my generation, how are we supposed to move and motivate, intimidate some white folk? Clench fists, raise the fists up, black power, right? That was supposed to do certain kind of rhetorical, political work for you, right? I'm offering for consideration that David Walker is doing something similar. The subject figures, the people to whom apparently he's addressing this text, generally can't read the text because they can't read. So why is he pumping it into the southern slaveholding states? For the slaves? Yeah. Or is it really for slave holders? And remember, this book gets banned throughout the slaveholding South. I mean, so one way you say, well, this is supposed to be a text that slaves are going to take up and read and rise up in revolutionary rebellion. Well, but it's a printed text. We've got distribution issues here. You've got an audience reception issue here in terms of who can actually read the text. So if that's your strategy, dude, I mean, there are a whole lot of problems that have to be solved in order for this to bear the kind of fruit you seemingly wanted to have. They read the text and then they're going to go act on it, et cetera. You got a whole lot of problems that you got to resolve for that to come about. But is that really what it was about?
Now I have thoughts on this, but I don't know if I wanted to let you, Robinson, say whether you wanted to keep going with Walker because I could say some more about this, but
we have to do a Zoom on that. We just put it out there because that, again, raises a lot of questions. But again, in the context of this question, is he advocating the wholesale killing, murdering of white people?
No. Yeah. So what I'll, say quickly on this is I want to first connect what Lou said to the work of Melvin Rogers. So Melvin Rogers is a philosopher who does really interesting work on the Africana tradition. And in terms of some of what he has written and said about the rhetorical work that Walker does in the appeal, as I recall, he like Lou, because in fact, Lou, I think you would agree that you'd be attributing to him a double mode of address, right? That it's not that you'd be saying he's not speaking at all to Black folk, right? But but that it would be sort of this both and, right? And so I would relate that to what I feel that Melvin Rogers has said on the matter. I'm going to go ahead and say I take him more at his word. And what I mean by that is, so he addresses the text in the title, first of all, to the colored citizens of the world, right? But then he also says very expressly to those the United States of America, right? And so this already introduces something interesting, right? It's true that the majority of the people to whom he expressly, right, it is particularly aimed at the United States, and the majority of the people he's talking about there are non-literate, right? That's probably true as well for the majority of the Black people of the whole world. But of course, that's already a more complicated situation because forget the fact that it's written, it's in a language that most of the Black people of the world can't understand.
And most of whom are not citizens.
And right, and that is, that's another thing that that Melvin loves to talk about, which is his odd choice of phrasing there, right? What does it mean for him to say citizens of the world, right? And there's all kinds of interesting things to think about with respect to the work that he's doing there. What I would say, just in terms of when I then think of sort of the meat of the text, what goes on in the 4 articles, because it's divided into these 4 articles. It's just, which you could basically call chapters. I think free Black people in the North are, in some ways, his primary target. And I say that in a way that, like, in the practical sense, right? So Lou brings up this practical question, right, of how are the people that you're directing this at even going to be able to read it, right? And I think that there's an important sense within which, if it gets to no one else, he knows he at least wants it to get to other people like himself. He's a Black man. He's originally from the South, but he's ended up in the North. He's in Boston when he writes this text, right? And I always tell people that, when you're telling the history of Africana philosophy, and if you're talking about the United States, you're looking at the 19th century, you have a crazy overrepresentation of textual stuff in Boston, right? In Massachusetts. In fact, let me say Massachusetts. When you say Massachusetts, there's so many people who you're gonna talk about in the 19th century from or based in Massachusetts. And if you think about that just on a numerical basis, it makes no sense. The state that Lou is from, Mississippi, right? Or if we take other states like South Carolina, right? These are states where you have masses of Black people in the 19th century, in a way that you have, a fraction of that population in a place like Massachusetts, right? But because we're talking at this point about a certain textual tradition, right, this is the kind of interesting overrepresentation we have. And so when David Walker is writing in Boston, there's certain things that he wants to say about self-respect, right, and ambition, and what it means to sort of set your face against oppression and figure out how to address it. Messages that I think he's directing to people who, like himself, are literate people in the North who can read. But at the same time, he makes efforts to get the text down to the South. There are things that he says in the text that are very much directed at enslaved people, and he tries to address the issue of literacy question, because he talks about those who get it, who can read, reading it to those who cannot read, right? And so, I think that it is in many ways a fascinating text for being from 1829, originally, right? And to me, creating a Black readership that's in so many ways, Lou's point is that Black readership barely exists, right? In an important sense. But I believe he is envisioning, a Black readership in a way that makes that text fascinating, and this will be my closing point, in a way that contrasts in a fascinating way with another text by another person from Massachusetts that has been important to both Lou and myself, right? I'm talking about The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Which I will again now give a shout out to Melvin Rogers, because the rhetoric of appeal in that text is another thing that he has talked about as well. But if you read that text, that's a fascinating case of a text that, there are people who shortly after it is published are calling it a political Bible for Black people in the United States, right? It is embraced by a growing Black intelligentsia of the time, right? But if you the way that he constructs the reader, he is often constructing a white reader, right? And so you're not going to understand Souls if you just focus on the way that he at times constructs a white reader, because he knows Black people are going to read what he's writing as well, and he's intervening into Black conversations in important ways in that book, but without really showing it, right? And so to me, while I think there's something to be said for how even the question of what fear you strike into the hearts of slaveholders, right? I mean, I'll just give one more shout out here to Kugoano. Kugoano addresses white people a lot, in his thoughts and sentiments on the evil of slavery, right? In somewhat direct ways. Walker, I think, tries to construct a Black public for his appeal, in ways that I think are fascinating and worth taking seriously. So that's my little thought on that.
I guess I hope you get a sense, Robinson, of the hopefulness to be gained by attending to these very streams of traditional texts that we have been hard at work now for several decades, bringing into professional academic philosophy for consideration and appreciation and critical study. Mm-hmm. What we try to gather under this notion of Africana philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I sense that I'm going to need to do an episode just devoted to Kugoano at some point in the future.
I think, let me endorse that and encourage you to do that with Chike, while opening on to an appreciation of a way of really rethinking enslavement. There's some scholars who are now asking us to be very careful and discriminating in our use of terms, and rather than talking about slavery, about enslavement. Mm-hmm. So that we're not reducing persons to this institutionalized, centuries-long holocaust. That there were persons who were in these institutionalized situations, but part of what has been going on for a long time, many scholars, a whole period of that some have looked at, and I think mischaracterized, some of the scholars have tried to prove that Black people were human, and just and like, well, there was a need. There was a denial of humanity going on, so that was an aspect. But to be able to see, even within enslavement, what was going on? Let's just take, what were the modes of agency of white folk, even in conditions of enslavement? And we take a title from one of the famous history books, The World the Slave Made. What kind of world making was going on? What kind of agency was being exercised among enslaved peoples in their world making? And what worlds did they make? What were they attending to? They were not simply what I would call one of these things in horror movies that have no souls, that just sort of zombies. And one of our pet peeves is recent terms that I found, in my judgment, reduces folks to zombies. The way in which people would use the term blacks are a black. And I will say black what? He are all black. a black, you will almost never see the phrase a white. You will see many phrases, whiteies, blacks plural and a black. But I'll never see a phrase a white. White is always an adjective that qualifies person or human being. So why are black people being reduced to just color thing? They're not. And so for me, for example, one of the things I have difficulty with, so I simply don't use it. I have always found difficulty using the phrase a Jew. I just find it, for me, very, very harsh. So I don't use that expression. I prefer to talk about persons who are Jewish, persons who are Palestinian, Black people, Jewish people, always are qualifying of our humanity. If we're going to have grounds on which we can work out a lot of what is most problematic for us, we're going to need grounds that involve, particularly if it's going to be ethically constituted, we must have something in common. But if our language use does not embrace any commonality, then I think the discourse is not going to help us get where we need to go. If one is simply a Jew or simply a Palestinian, nothing in those phrases, nothing in those highlights anything common about either one. One is a Jew, one is a Palestinian. There's nothing common about them. On the other hand, a person who is Jewish, a person who is Palestinian are both persons. What can we do on that terrain? We can't do much on the terrain of a Jew and a Palestinian because they have nothing in common discursively. One's a Jew, one's a Palestinian. Nothing in common. But a person who is Jewish and a person who is Palestinian, now we've got a different discursive terrain on which to work.